So hey everybody, my name is Aubrey Shinholster. I'm the Vice President of the Community Network Council, and I would like to welcome you to our second session in our Progressive Self-Care series. Today we're going to look at adverse childhood experiences and talk about some of the trauma and some of the issues that our youth are facing. We have experts here who are going to walk us through and guide us through this discussion today. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., who will tell us a little bit more and introduce us to our guest speaker. Dr. Moore.
Okay, Aubrey, morning, family. Good to see you. Barbara, good to see you. Ricky, glad to have you here. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I think I'm an expert in that. I've definitely dealt with some adverse childhood experiences, so I'm here to share and learn myself, and definitely excited to have a trusted friend, a colleague, and definitely an expert in this field in so many ways to help guide us through a conversation. Ricky's gonna give us some information around this topic, but the hope is that we would be in conversation, questions, concerns, anything y'all are wondering about around this topic. This is the opportunity to have some conversation, to answer some questions. So this is really designed to be for the people, by the people. So we want to encourage y'all to write down, to participate, to join in. So I'm going to turn it over to Ricky to give all the expertise and all the credentials that he has in reference to his work. I know him as a trusted friend and a colleague. We share a publisher.
Eddie froze for a second there. All right. Well, I will pick up where Dr. Moore left off. We share a publisher. That's true. We both share a publisher, which is Corwin Press. But actually, Dr. Moore and I first met a number of years ago. We co-facilitated an institute in Chicago on racial equity within schools and looking at particularly practices related to the disproportionate representation of Black students in exclusionary school discipline. And when Eddie and I co-facilitated that institute together, we learned that we had lived in a lot of the same towns, Seattle, St. Petersburg, Florida, New York City, kind of had covered a lot of the same areas in the country and had some mutual friends. And so Dr. Moore and I became friends and colleagues. And so it's an honor to be here with everyone this morning. Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you, Ms. Phillips. And welcome everyone. And I hope this morning together, we get to learn from and with one another. I'm going to actually pull up some slides and I'm going to spend some time just presenting on some content to give us a kind of foundation and a context, and then we can move into a discussion. And I'm interested to hear if there are questions, things that spark your thinking, or even if there are requests for additional resources to take your learning further about these topics, because we do just have a brief amount of time together this morning to talk about a topic that is pretty far-reaching and complex and impacts many of us in many different ways. So with that, I'll introduce myself. I'll talk a little bit about my background, and then we'll go into exploring topics today related to adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and also explore research on healthy human resilience. So with that being said, I am a co-author of a book called Building Resilience in Students Impacted by Adverse Childhood Experiences, which is actually a workbook that public schools and some charter schools use throughout the country to develop social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students that are trauma-informed and culturally responsive. My background is actually in education. I started as a New York City public high school teacher and taught in one of New York City's highest performing high poverty schools, and then went on to teach in alternative middle school and high school settings for students who had previously been incarcerated or expelled or pushed out of school. And then went back to graduate school and took on a district administrative position as a behavior specialist, supporting children in pre-K all the way to 12th grade with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And much like Dr. Moore was sharing earlier, That's my professional background, but my personal background related to this work is that I'm someone who has my own history of adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and grew up in a family with folks who loved one another dearly, but there was also generations of addiction and alcoholism and different forms of abuse and neglect that got passed down from generation to generation, just like eye color or, other traits. I mean, it was the patterns of some of those traumas and those survival and coping strategies that maybe weren't very healthy, things like alcoholism, abuse, etc., got passed from generation to generation and not spoken about, not dealt with. It wasn't considered even appropriate to talk about these topics. They became kind of family secrets. And so a lot of my own journey has been informed by my own recovery and healing from experiences of trauma, ACEs, and also my own struggles in life with addiction. And so with that, that's a little bit about my personal and professional background. I want to pause for a moment as we get started this morning and think about something that you feel grateful for within the last 24 hours. And the reason why I like to do this as I get started with each session, and this is something that I do in all the sessions that I do, is I want us to just take a moment in the busyness of our day to just reflect on a single blessing, something that has maybe lifted your spirits, touched your heart, supported your well-being within the last 24 hours. Could be something from this morning, could be maybe if you got up early and got to see the sunrise, or maybe it's rainy and gray where you're at, but maybe you have your health or your loved ones or your pets, or you just have your spirit or your faith or your whatever it might be that you are thankful for. Could even be a cup of coffee. Think about one small thing that you feel thankful for. And if you feel comfortable, please feel free to enter that into the chat. What is one thing that you feel thankful for? So gratitude for health, for friendships, for having a warm, safe home. I'm thankful today. I'm joining you all from San Francisco, the unceded land of the Ohlone peoples, and I'm thankful for looking outside my window, seeing beautiful weather, some sunshine today. Thankful for my health and this opportunity to be here with you. So with that being said, the work that I do is now with schools and districts across the United States and Canada in helping them to develop multi-tiered social, emotional, and behavioral supports. So in other words, I mostly train educators on how to support students. I also work with my co-authors and colleagues, Victoria Romero, who is a retired principal of 2 turnaround schools in Seattle, and prior to that was a classroom teacher for 35 years, as well as my co-author Amber Warner, who is a licensed clinical social worker that practices and works in schools, hospitals, and in private practice with children and families impacted by trauma. I also have the good fortune to collaborate with the California Surgeon General's office, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and her colleagues in helping to create some trauma-informed care and trauma-informed trainings, rather, to support trauma-informed care throughout the state of California. So we're going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences and trauma this morning. And I want to just say that some of the things I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes are difficult. They're painful. They're things that some of us may have experienced in our own lives, or we might be working with or have young people in our families who we care for deeply who have experienced these things. And it can sometimes bring up some tough and difficult emotions for folks and even some challenging memories, etc. So one of the things I want to share as we get started is to please manage your well-being and care for yourself during this conversation. If it feels too intense, feel free to step away or to get a drink of water or to stretch or to do whatever you need to care for your own well-being as I talk through some of the research on adverse childhood experiences and trauma. So as we get started, please know that your well-being matters and you're encouraged to care for yourself as needed. I'm going to begin by briefly discussing the ACE study, which was the first study of its kind to look at the long-term effects of childhood trauma and to look at how different types of adverse childhood experiences that occur during childhood affect our health as adults. This study was conducted in 1997 by Robert Anda and Vincent Felitti in partnership with Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. And it was conducted in Southern California with about 17,500 participants. And they asked these folks, have you ever experienced these 10 types of childhood trauma or adversity? Things like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, death of a parent, domestic violence, incarceration of a parent, person in the home suffering from a mental illness, or abandonment due to separation or divorce. And then they looked at the number of adverse childhood experiences that folks had experienced growing up, and they looked at their health records. And they asked, is there any relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences that occur between birth and age 18 and somebody's physical, mental, or behavioral health as an adult? And they found three striking findings. The first was that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, were far more common than they had anticipated. So of those 17,500 participants, 20% reported having experienced sexual abuse. We have other studies that suggest that that's as many as 1 out of every 4 young women and 1 out of every 6 young men sitting in a typical classroom in this country have experienced or are experiencing sexual abuse. The ACE study also found that about a third of participants had experienced physical abuse, and about half of participants had experienced multiple ACEs. Something that I should mention is that of that first ACE study, those 17,500 folks, 75% of them were white, and all of them were able to participate in the study because of employer healthcare coverage. So they were also an overwhelmingly middle-class population of people. Subsequent research has gone on to show that adverse childhood experiences and trauma are prevalent across race, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, geographic region, so whether you live in a rural, suburban, or urban community. We see that trauma is prevalent across humanity. Now, the way that trauma is responded to and the access that people have to care, that can be heavily impacted by forms of systemic oppression and inequity, poverty, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, anti-immigrant discrimination, etc. The ACE study also showed that ACEs tend to cluster. This is kind of common sense. We know that, for example, if you have a parent who's an alcoholic, you're then statistically more likely to experience forms of abuse or neglect in the home. But the third finding was the most striking and groundbreaking finding of the ACE study, which is that ACEs have a dose relationship with long-term health impairments. And the key phrase there is dose relationships, and I'll explain what that means. What they found was that for every adverse childhood experience that occurs, it increases the likelihood that someone could develop a physical, mental, or behavioral health impairment later in life. So for example, someone with 4 ACEs was found to be twice as likely to develop cancer as someone with none. 7 times more likely to struggle with addiction, 12 times more likely to struggle with substance abuse, or 12 times more likely to struggle with severe depression and suicidality compared to someone with no ACEs. In fact, someone with 6 ACEs is shown to have a life expectancy about 20 years shorter than someone with none. ACEs were shown to have a strong correlation with the health impairments you see on the screen: cancer, heart disease, emphysema, substance abuse issues, etc. Now, here's one of the most important things that I want you to take away from our time together today. In fact, it may, even if it's the only thing you take away, I want it to be this: that while ACEs and trauma are prevalent across humanity, resilience is our birthright. Each and every human being has an innate capacity for resilience. And we have research that shows that it doesn't matter how many ACEs you've experienced. If you have enough protective factors, healthy relationships, a safe enough home environment, a healthy enough diet, things that you love, that you're passionate about, that give your life meaning, then it helps to nurture that innate capacity for resilience so that our past is not our destiny. And so when we learn about these things, don't let it weigh heavy on your heart and make you feel like you might feel, because I certainly felt these ways, that I was broken, or look at my family, or look at the things that have happened. Where's a sense of hope? Is this going to be my future too? And absolutely not. At any point in our lives, we have that innate capacity for resilience that we can nurture, that we could turn towards health, even in small ways that can make a big impact. And so when we think about ourselves, our children, the young people we work with, we have to keep in mind our past is not our destiny. At any point in someone's journey, there is always that opportunity for awakening, for turning towards health, for turning towards resilience, for nurturing their well-being. So with that being said, when we think about that first ACE study, there were only 10 types of ACEs that those researchers looked at. They didn't even include things like homelessness or community violence or gang violence or poverty. And so what we understand now is that there are many, many different types of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. Some are very severe and acute, others are chronic and ongoing. And it's also personal based on the individual, what they're experiencing, how much support they have, how old they are, etc. It can be helpful to understand that there are different realms in which trauma occurs. There are types of trauma that occur within the household, within the family. Abuse, neglect, incarceration of a loved one, etc. There are also types of trauma that occur within the community. Community violence, poverty, lack of affordable housing, lack of jobs that pay a living wage, historical and generational trauma. In the 1960s, child psychiatrists in Canada were trying to figure out why the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were 300% more likely to be institutionalized in child psychiatric facilities. These were the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors living in Canada. They didn't grow up where the Holocaust occurred. They didn't even have parents who lived through the Holocaust. Many of them had never even met their grandparents who had lived through the Holocaust, and yet they were 300% more likely to be institutionalized for severe psychiatric challenges. Now, that research came from the 1960s. Decades later, we have research on what's known as generational or historical trauma, which shows that when a trauma occurs to a mass population of people, which could include a war, a Holocaust, slavery, colonization, a genocide, mass migration due to climate disintegration. It impacts, and a pandemic, which we'll talk about in a moment. It can impact the health of that generation, and it has the potential to impact the health of future generations, even to impact our genetics. There's been research by the University of Washington in partnership with different native tribal nations that has found that some native and indigenous children, many of them have genetic predispositions to things like diabetes, heart disease, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Now, having a genetic predisposition does not mean it's going to happen, right? Remember, our past is not our destiny. It just means that trauma can get encoded even within our genes, and it makes it all the more important for us to lean towards practicing our self-care, caring for those we love, strengthening those relationships. Healthy relationships are such an important component of resilience, but so are things like exercise and having a sense of hope and possibility, and having a sense of purpose, and having things that you enjoy and love and that lift your spirits, and can also be even pets, or and animals, or a sport, or art, or something that you that enlivens you, right? These are many different ways to help us to feel a sense of healthy aliveness, a sense of safety, a sense of connection. But it makes us realize it can be very valuable to look at research by folks like Dr. Joy DeGruy and her work on post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and her work on trauma and indigenous peoples, and to understand that also when we connect to our culture, whatever your culture may be and your experience of your culture in healthy ways. So noticing the strengths and beauty of your own identity and culture, your gender, race, sexual orientation, where you grew up, who raised you, aspects of your culture in terms of art and expression and values, and also language, that also when we connect to our own culture in positive ways, we're affirming our generational resilience. And when we help young people through culturally responsive teaching, through ways to have a positive sense of self and who they are and to know their history, that supports their generational resilience. Any community that has experienced historical trauma also has profound generational resilience. We also realize there's forms of trauma that can be cumulative, repeated exposure to discrimination, to microaggressions, to prejudice, to systemic oppression. That's called minority stress, according to some researchers, and can be linked to things like high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, because of the pain of those million tiny cuts. I'll give you just one example, and that can be racism, can be ableism, sexism, anti-immigrant discrimination. I'll give you one example. When we look at research from the Family Acceptance Project, based out of San Francisco State University, we find that when LGBTQ plus young people have families who reject them because of their sexual orientation or gender, they are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to LGBTQ plus young people who have families that love and accept them, including their sexual orientation and gender. So that family rejecting behaviors becomes just one example of that cumulative trauma, those million tiny cuts, and then we see the direct impact on the mental health of those young people. Now, if you happen to have LGBTQ plus young people in your family, or you happen to mentor or work with queer or trans youth, when you affirm those young people in their sexual orientation and gender, what we find is if they have a caring, trusting adult, even who's not a family member, could be a volunteer, could be a teacher, could be a mentor, it reduces their risk of suicidality by as much as 40 to 65%, even if they're experiencing that rejection at home from their family members. So we can play a critical role in being allies to LGBTQ plus young people. But that's just one example, right, of looking at cumulative trauma. As I said, that applies to many forms of discrimination and oppression. We also can have trauma that is environmental. Wildfires, natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. As many of you are thinking about this, and we are going to shift towards resilience. So I promise we're not just going to stay in the pain, but we recognize that every young person is born at a different social location, has different access to power and privilege. We cannot call ourselves trauma informed unless we are also doing work to be racially and socially just, because children who grow up in poverty have less access to quality healthcare, mental health resources, etc. But also the way that trauma is responded to can be heavily impacted by forms of oppression, things like systemic racism, for example. We have research that shows that Black boys make up anywhere from 8 to 18% of the preschool population, depending on the state. So not the majority of the preschool population, but what we do find, and this is research that was done in a few states in the Southeast, that Black boys who in preschool who happen to have 3 or more ACEs, so an even smaller percentage, make up as much as 75% of the children repeatedly suspended or expelled from preschool. So we find that because of racism, Black, Indigenous students of color are more, if they happen to have experienced trauma, they're more likely to receive punishment in school rather than care. So the work we do towards racial justice, towards social justice is essential for fostering resilience and healthy young people in communities, because we have to look at racism and those forms of oppression as types of trauma. And as a white person, I have to think about in what ways is racism, of which is part of how I was brought up, is part of who I am, and is a soul sickness, is an aspect that can fragment the psyche, that can make it difficult for me to even see my own biases, my own ways that I may dehumanize others or not see them in their full humanity because of ways that I have been implicitly or explicitly conditioned within a racist society as a white person. So even as white people, we have to reflect on in what ways does racism cause trauma and also cause a type of personal trauma to myself as well as then to others, because hurt people hurt people. So, my message to other white folks is doing our own work is essential then to prevent furthering and perpetuating the trauma of racism. And then there is a journey that is unique for those who are people of color and Black, Indigenous folks who experience racism, and that own journey to maintain one's voice, one's sense of self-worth, and to heal. And Resme Menaken, whose book, My Grandmother's Hands, is a wonderful book for folks to look if you want to explore deeper into aspects around racial trauma and healing. Again, the title of that book, My Grandmother's Hands, is a wonderful book. And I'll put that in the chat. There's also a fantastic book for those who might, if you've experienced abuse and neglect in your family, there's a wonderful book by Pete Walker called Complex PTSD. There's also books like The Body Keeps the Score, etc. But Complex PTSD by Pete Walker, I'll put this in the chat as well, is a phenomenal book for adults who are recovering from our own history of abuse or neglect within our families. There's also wonderful 12-step communities like Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. There's wonderful healing options available for folks who are interested that can be very, very important, because if we're a parent or a mentor, we have to put our own oxygen mask on first and do our own healing work in order to best support the young people in our families or those that we support through our volunteer work, or maybe our work as educators or social workers, etc. To then talk about the pandemic as an ACE, I just want to briefly acknowledge that during the past year and a half, we have seen nationally increased rates of domestic violence, increased rates of parent and caregiver anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and relapse, as well as parent and caregiver suicidality. And we've had young people that have been increasingly isolated. So the social emotional impact of this pandemic is going to be with us for years to come. We're in a marathon and not a sprint. So if we work in a field where we're committed to making a difference for young people, we have to think about how have our practices, how will they evolve as a result of this time? How have our priorities changed as a result of this time? How have the needs of our young people shifted as a result of this pandemic? Now, I want to look at time because I want to wrap up within the next 10 minutes or so in order to give time for questions, comments, dialogue. But there's a couple things I think are important for me to cover before I wrap up this part of our session together. And that is to look at some of the impacts of trauma on the brain development of children, to connect it just briefly to behavior, because Tuesday evening, I'm going to do a session where we're going to do a deep dive into behavior as a form of communication. And then I want to just close with talking about what is healthy human resilience, because sometimes it's a word we throw around a lot, but we might not have a common understanding of it. So I wanted to, as I mentioned, talk about the impact of trauma on the brain development of children. And what we see here on the slide is a brain scan of 2 3-year-old children. One of them is a child who has not experienced any trauma or ACEs. And the other is a child who has experienced significant abuse and neglect and is in an orphanage, actually was in an orphanage at the time of this study. The colors represent the amount of brain activity. Red means a lot of activity, green and yellow, a moderate amount, purple and black, little to no activity. The top of the slide is our prefrontal cortex, behind our foreheads, moving into our temporal lobes, the parts of our brain that help with making decisions, handling our emotions, communicating, thinking about consequences before we take action, things like regulation and executive functioning. Basically, everything a young person needs to be behaviorally, academically, and socially, emotionally successful in school is in some way connected to those regions of the brain that you see at the top of the slide. The bottom of the slide, we see that brainstem region, that amygdala, moving into that amygdala and limbic system. So that brainstem region is our survival center of the brain, fight, flight, and freeze. And when that center of the brain is activated, it disrupts functioning in the prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes because it needs all of our energy. So when we look at the difference between these two children, we see that child who's experienced significant abuse and trauma, they have less activity in that prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes. That survival center of the brain, though, is lit up. They're in that space of fight, fight, flight, and freeze. So we might see some of those fight behaviors like aggression, defiance, tantrums. We might see some of those flight or freeze behaviors, shutting down, not talking, anxiety, depression, withdrawal, or running away, hiding, eloping from the classroom, etc. And research shows that if a child has experienced ACEs and trauma and they don't have enough protective factors, they don't have a safe enough home, a healthy enough relationship with their loved ones, their family, etc., that their brain stays in that space of fight, flight, and freeze, even when they're at school, even 3 weeks after maybe a domestic violence fight at home happened. But if they don't have that safe enough place at home or at school, etc., to calm down their nervous system, to reduce that toxic stress response, their brain stays in that hyper aroused, hyper vigilant space. And when we're in that toxic stress response for a long period of time, our body gets flooded with cortisol, with adrenaline, with stress hormones. And when that happens over a lifetime, it leads to inflammation, which leads to cancer, heart disease, those long-term health impairments you saw earlier. That survival center of the brain also gets triggered by threats to social safety. So that includes things like stereotype threat in the classroom when a child has a teacher who they feel has a bias against them and people like them. Could be because of their race, gender, ability, disability, country of origin, immigration status, etc. It triggers that threat to social safety, and it makes it very difficult for that young person to learn. This again is why so much of the work I do is also around looking at ways that we are trauma-informed and culturally responsive in order to create authentically safe, welcoming schools and environments for the young people that we serve. Now, within the family, we have to think about how do we help the children in our family to self-regulate, to calm that survival center of the brain. And one of the ways we do that is to help ourselves to self-regulate. A dysregulated adult cannot help a dysregulated child. In other words, if your child is tantruming and screaming, and now you're yelling, and now you're getting upset, you're just throwing fuel onto the fire. We have to do the best we can, which is not always easy, to build that muscle of, okay, I need to take a deep breath right now. This is a 3-year-old or a 16-year-old. I need to step away for a minute. I need to find my calm. And I need to come back, and then I'm going to state my expectation. I'm going to connect with my child, and then I'm going to correct their behavior. In other words, I know you're upset right now, but we don't throw things on the floor, so please pick that up. Or I know you want to keep playing with the Play-Doh, but it's time for us to go. So how do we clean up? I'm going to try to do my best to first find my calm. Think like a tree. I need to have deep roots and a little sway and flexibility here. I need to take a deep breath, some positive self-talk, take a minute. Then I need to, once I have found my calm, then I can connect and then correct or redirect my child's behavior, connect before correct, notice my child, notice what they're feeling, and then let them know what's expected. Because when we can be calm in those moments that are tense, we are more likely to be able to help our child to co-regulate, to calm down their stress response. But that is a skill that we build. So we have to celebrate progress, not perfection, because we are human beings. We can be having a bad day. We can be exhausted. We can be on our last nerve. We can be pushed to the end of our rope. So in those moments, what do I need to do? If it's take deep breaths, if it's listen to some music that lifts my spirit, if it's to take a step back for a second and not engage in a power struggle with this child, what can I do to first self-regulate to help my child to co-regulate? Because behavior is a form of communication through which children communicate their needs for safety, belonging, and feeling valued. And we're going to talk about this at great length when we get together on Tuesday evening. And we're going to explore what do we mean, because this isn't just good behavior, bad behavior. This is behavior. A child might want to feel a sense of safety, belonging, and feeling valued, so they get really excited and join a sports team at school. Another child might want to feel a sense of safety, belonging, and feeling valued. They don't get that need met at home. They don't get that need met at school, but they do get that need met when they join a gang. Mm. right? And having lost young people to gang violence and community violence, and having experienced that pain, I can tell you that our work then is, how do we help the young people we work with, or the young people who we care for, to get those needs for safety, belonging, and feeling valued met in ways that are healthy, ways that are not going to harm them or harm others. And so we're going to be exploring a Tuesday evening what we mean by safety: physical, intellectual, and social emotional safety. And depending on who attends that evening, we might talk about that in terms of our work as a volunteer, an educator, a social worker, a parent. We'll see where that conversation goes. Behavior communicates a need for belonging, and that means connection. We have research that shows that, unfortunately, when parents and caregivers are out in public, they spend most of their time on their phone, and they only interact with their child when their child does what? Acts up or misbehaves. Now, if I'm a child and I have to act up to get you to put your phone down, then that's what I'm going to do. Because as a child, attention from my parents and caregivers is survival. So if I have to misbehave to get you to put your phone down and interact with me, then that's what I'm going to do. Which means that you're actually teaching me as the child that I have to misbehave in order to get the connection that I need. I have to settle for negative attention as a substitute for authentic connection and belonging. Which means now that when I get in trouble, I'm going to be unfazed by it, because that might be the time that I actually feel like I matter. So I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to beg, I'm not going to plead, I'm not going to say I'm sorry, because this might actually be the moment when I feel like I matter to you, because it's what gets my parent or caregiver to put their phone down and actually interact with me. So we have to think about screen time limits, not just for the children, but for ourselves as well. This is a very powerful device. This gives us a lot of dopamine hits. This gives us a lot of little chemicals in our brain, a lot of little drugs that can impact our ability to focus, impact our ability to manage our emotions, impact our ability to connect with others, and to manage our anxiety. And the reality is, this has a lot of power, these devices that we hold in our hands, but all things in moderation. So we have to think about screen time limits sometimes for ourselves, and make sure we have some one-on-one time with our children where we're asking them about their day, where we're listening to them. We're not correcting them. We're not interrogating them. We're just talking with them. We're just having that FaceTime that's positive, that's neutral, that's putting an investment in the relationship account. That way, when there's struggle, we have something to draw from. We don't have to rely on a device to manipulate our children or further dysregulate them, because if all we're doing is handing a child a device every time they're being silly or acting up or getting fidgety or getting on our nerves, we're giving a child like a little slot machine. Just give them a bunch of little dopamine hits, which dysregulates the brain, impacts the way that their brain develops, sets them up for struggles with attention deficit, with struggles with anxiety, and potentially long-term even struggles with addiction. And that could even be addiction to the phone or video games, etc. So when we think about screen time limits, again, we have to think about it for ourselves as well as our young people, because it's a wonderful device and a blessing to have this kind of technology in moderation. And lastly, behavior communicates that need for feeling valued, for students having a voice and choice, not students, but children as well, right? Because I'm talking about parents and families, giving children appropriate choices, having those boundaries, not being your child's best friend, but being their parent who listens to them and responds to their behavior in ways that are connected and firm, where there can be rewards, there can be consequences, there can be appropriate choices, and where children can feel heard. So lastly, I want to just mention, what is resilience? So it's a word I've thrown around a lot this morning, and then we'll open it up to a conversation. I apologize if I went a little long this morning, but I felt like I needed to. So what is resilience? I want you to think about it for yourself. If I were to ask you, what is resilience? And you can enter it in the chat if you like. What is a word or a phrase that comes to mind? What is resilience? What does it mean to you? There's no wrong answer to this question, by the way. It could mean grit, strength, perseverance, bouncing back, overcoming challenges. These are all aspects of resilience. These are all things that come up for folks when I ask this question. I want to invite you, though, to go a little bit deeper. Think about your own life, because each and every one of us has been resilient in different ways, has had challenges that we have faced. What does a young person need to be resilient? In other words, what got you through? For some of us, it might have been a friend, a family member, a parent, a faith or spiritual practice, a musical instrument, a hobby, a sport, a book. There are times in my life where a song has gotten me through. So these are those protective factors, and they're different for each of us, but our hope is that each young person has enough of them. Fortunately, we have research on healthy human resilience that shows that resilience is more than just grit. It is more than just pushing through. It's more than just perseverance. Because sometimes we grew up in families, and Claudia Black talks about this, where we learned 3 unspoken rules: don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. And sometimes we think don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel is resilience. But healthy resilience is actually an ability, and this is based on research from Bonnie Bernard, to have healthy enough relationships, to feel compassion for others, to feel connected, to have some friendships. And this is true for young people and adults, to learn problem-solving skills, flexibility, thinking about consequences before we take action, long-term thinking. Asking for help when we need it is actually an aspect of healthy resilience. It's not an aspect of weakness. Emotional autonomy, knowing what we're feeling and when it's safe enough to feel those feelings. Resilient people can cry when they're sad, laugh when they're happy. Having a positive sense of self, having a sense of humor sometimes because we're human beings. And it's not all going to go perfectly, and we're going to make mistakes. And then lastly, having a sense of hope and purpose and possibility. Bonnie Bernard was interviewing a 16-year-old young man. He was formerly gang affiliated. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said. He said, for young people to be resilient, they need someone to walk with, and they need somewhere to walk to. They need someone to walk with, that relationship. They need somewhere to walk to, that sense of hope and purpose and possibility. So what we realize then is resilience is actually a variety of different social emotional skills that are best learned and practiced within healthy relationships. Resilience is strength-based, it's personal, and it's cultural. We each have unique things that have helped us to be resilient, and we each have unique growth areas, and resilience is our birthright. There are some people who say resilience is 30% genetic and 70% learned. In other words, it doesn't matter who you are, we each have that capacity. If we get those relationships, we have those protective factors, we find those things that bring us some joy, some health, some well-being, to nurture that birthright, that gift of resilience. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Moore to facilitate a conversation with us if he's on the session. And if not, we'll just see where the conversation goes. But I hope that was helpful. And I'm going to look back through the chat and see if there's any questions that I may have missed or anything like that. And please feel free to chime in either in the chat or even to unmute if there are any questions that you have. And we can spend the rest of this time just in discussion and reflection.
Oh, thank you, Ricky. I'm hoping everybody can give you an emoji or something to just say, we appreciate you in some way. And I just want to say it verbally here. There's my attempt at doing some kind of emoji. There you go, somebody there. Thank you there, Barb. I appreciate it. All right, there's my emoji. There it is. Ricky, let me ask you, to kick off the questions, see if anybody else has got some, we can hear those as well. But you mentioned the phone. I was looking at something by the Surgeon General about the rise in really suicide and depression as it relates to young people. And there was some real reference to virtual attacks, social media. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in reference to not just, kind of that cell phone addiction piece, but also what we're seeing happening to young people on social media?
Yeah, certainly. And it's very much connected in the sense that what I spoke about in terms of the impact of cell phones on parenting, Then we think about, so, okay, so the child has learned, okay, in order to get my parent to put down their phone, I have to misbehave, I have to act up, etc. So I have to settle for a negative attention in order to get that connection. And that one-on-one connection, that human connection, a parent, a caregiver, it could be an auntie, a grandparent, a teacher, a mentor, that FaceTime, that attention, my focus is on you. We're in a conversation. I'm listening to you. That, even if it's with a baby, that emotional attunement that happens when we show up and we offer our presence, our attention to another human being, that emotional attunement is the foundation for empathy, for emotional regulation, for knowing what we're feeling and how to handle our feelings, for knowing how to connect, for knowing how to calm down and soothe when we're feeling anxious and sad. How do you help a baby who's having a tantrum? You hold them, right? That connection. So that's the child. So let's think about the child as the child. That's the baby, the infant, the young child. Now let's think about the child as the child gets older and they end up on social media. What is social media? It is an economy of attention. It teaches young people that the only thing that matters, and it doesn't just teach young people this, folks, it teaches all of us this, which is that the only thing that matters is views and likes and followers. And attention is not the same as connection. You can have 1,000 friends, 10,000 friends, 100,000 followers rather on social media. But when the you know what hits the fan and you don't have a real human being to call, you have a lot of attention, you don't have a lot of connection. So what we find are young people who spend the majority of their time on these devices. They're more virtually plugged in. There's a lot of attention happening. There's not a lot of authentic connection. So we end up with data that shows we have a generation of teenagers where, and this is even before the pandemic, we had 2017, the Pew Center did research, and decades of research, for the first time, the #1 challenge that teenagers reported experiencing in school was anxiety and depression. Not bullying, not peer pressure, not fitting in, not getting good grades, anxiety and depression. We have young people that are more plugged in virtually and less connected, so they feel more alone, more anxious, and more depressed. Also, they're physiologically more dysregulated, because we have studies that show that many young people say that they stay connected to their phone 24 hours a day, meaning they actually get up throughout the night when they get a message or a notification and respond to it. They're not even getting they're not even getting adequate sleep. So what that does to brain development, we don't even know. We're in a huge kind of moment of a social experiment, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. That's why I said this isn't all or nothing. It's about finding healthy limits, which is difficult because these devices are very addictive. Now, that's just one piece. What the Surgeon General spoke about is, in addition to just the addiction to the phone and being so connected all the time virtually, but not having those human relationships and connections that we need so much in person, that's just one piece. The other piece that the Surgeon General was referencing are things like the bullying, the body image issues, the self-loathing, the constant comparing that happens on Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat or a lot of these different apps, where young people are growing up and they're comparing their bodies to Instagram influencers, or they're thinking, why don't I have as many followers and likes as this other person does? What do I need to do in order to get that level of attention? And then the folks who have a lot of followers, what do I need to do to get even more? And so it's endless. It's like drinking salt water. We're never satisfied. And it's harmful because it doesn't help us to cultivate a positive sense of self, to feel good enough. It instills a profound sense of shame, which during adolescence, that's especially painful. That's a very vulnerable time. And then we have things like the online bullying. you know, and the targeting, and then the exposure to collective trauma. When we have young people that are viewing things that are, you know, whether it's viewing something as horrific and traumatic as the murder of George Floyd, or a young person who has unrestricted access to the internet at home and might see things that, one, they're not developmentally appropriate, or they're very painful or traumatic to see, or they don't have any caring or trusting or loving adults to actually talk to them and help them understand what they just viewed. And so they carry that with them. I have an elementary school I was working with where they were actually afraid that a lot of their kids were experiencing sexual abuse because of the behaviors they were seeing on the playground at the elementary school. And what we learned was not that the children were experiencing sexual abuse, but that the majority of the children had unrestricted access to the internet at home. So they were seeing those things and then displaying symptoms of sexual abuse at school. So and we're in the midst of it. So there's not a quick fix, but there is okay, so where do I start with this? Well, first of all, check your own amount of screen time. Notice how much time you spend on your phone. Think about, are there times when my child, my family, or if I'm working with a young person, we can actually, first of all, set aside some time where we don't use our phones. We turn them off, even if it's just for 15 minutes, or set them aside just to have a conversation, have a meal, just to connect, even if it's just for a few minutes. Can we unplug, so to speak? If I have a young person who's a middle school student, a high school student, a teenager that I'm working with, a child in my home who's of that age, can I talk to them about how frequently we use the phone, et cetera, when it might be time to set it aside? I mean, I know some parents say you can have the phone until 11 o'clock and then it goes in my room and you get it in the morning, but you don't get to be on the phone between 11 a.m. and 6 a.m. when you wake up for school because you need to rest. And their kids might fight them on that, but that's a rule in the household. So we just have to think about, where's my entry point? What's one small thing I can do to start to talk with young people, or about setting up some boundaries around phone use, around talking about what they experience in social media and on these platforms, listening to them, asking them how they navigate some of these things if they're experiencing that bullying or that comparison, that constant drive to compare, and getting a sense of how they handle all that. Because right now we're just seeing symptoms of it. We're not really listening to address the cause. And that's going to require us to connect and listen to our young people and to put down our own phones in order to do that. I don't know if that was helpful at all, Eddie, but there's not a solution to this that's like a one answer, unfortunately.
So, hey, so this is Aubrey. We have some questions in the chat. Dr. Moore, if it's okay, I'd like to ask those questions. All right. So I'll start with Joan, you asked a question. I believe Barbara responded. It was specifically related to how CNC helps children who are dealing with ACEs. Did you feel like your question was answered? I'll assume it was, and I know that you know Barb very well, and I know that you could follow up. So if you have any questions, can you just ask it again if you need any additional questions beyond what Barb provided, and I'll ask it to the larger group. But Ricky, we had a question for you. It was, do you have any information on how does, because you talked about how sort of the trauma is encoded in our genes. And from that statement, I have a question of how does it get encoded into our genes?
So that's based, I mean, I'm going to stay in my lane because I'm not a genetics researcher, but what research shows is that trauma can impact this is research on epigenetics, which is how our genes are expressed. And what research has shown is that when folks experience trauma, it can impact the methylation of our genes. Basically can impact the ways that our genes, the likelihood at which certain genes are going to be expressed more than others. And it can even impact the chromosomes themselves and the telomeres of the chromosomes and the kind of casing, if you will. I don't know how to put this in kind of non-scientific terms, but it can basically impact the structure of our genes and the likelihood at which certain genes are expressed. And likely because, and that's probably because in future generations, when they experience those traumas, there was a physical impact, a lot of toxic stress on the body. Those people had to continue to survive and cope. And some of those health impairments, some of those things started to show up within their body, their life, and then get passed down in terms of through the genetics to their child, and the likelihood that some of those genes could be expressed. So what I want to emphasize, and I'm going to do two things, because I'm not a genetics researcher, but what I can do is put an article in the chat for folks who want to dive a little bit deeper into the science of it and look at gene methylation and look at genetic expression. But what I do want to emphasize is it impacts the likelihood that certain genes are expressed, which might be genes that set up a predisposition for things like cancer, diabetes, et cetera. That's the likelihood that they'll be expressed. It is not an inevitability. And I think that's just the one thing I want to emphasize, is that it's not saying you experience a trauma, you develop, high blood pressure, and then you automatically pass that on to your child, and your child is now doomed to have high blood pressure too. It can impact the likelihood that certain genes are expressed, which means that if that young person has enough protective factors, practices self-care, has a healthy enough diet, all those good things that help support our health and well-being, they may never develop high blood pressure. In other words, they might never develop any of those symptoms that they have genetic predispositions to as a result of that exposure to trauma. That's probably the most important thing, I think, to take away from that genetics and epigenetics research, because in these conversations, I believe you have to center the resilience and don't have people walk away feeling like trauma somehow leaves us broken or damaged. It creates a possibility actually for us to become incredibly strong individuals who are capable of hurting, healing, and then helping others. There were two books I wanted to mention, and I'll add a third one that I mentioned earlier, and I promised to put in the chat. And so I want to do that before I forget. Aubrey, were there any other questions?
Well, Ricky, thank you. Keep putting those in the chat. We definitely want to build a resource list. Can you explain self-care? I hear it so much. We hear it so much. What does that mean to you? How do you define self-care if people ask you about that? And how often, how frequent? I mean, what's your sense of self-care? Is it personal? Is it individual? Or is there really a kind of definition for all?
That's an excellent question. I have, my definition, so I think self-care is personal. My definition of self-care is an orientation of kindness towards the self. An orientation of kindness towards the self. In other words, self-care is different from self-improvement. So treating yourself with kindness, with respect, with gentleness at times. And that might show up in terms of our mindset in a situation, a willingness to offer ourselves or someone else grace, a willingness to honor the fact that we sometimes can't fit all the things we have to get done into a day. And so inevitably there's things we don't get to, we drop the ball, etc. But how do I, take a moment to pause and just appreciate the difference that I did make today, the blessings that I had today, the three good things that happened today that I somehow was part of. So sometimes I think self-care is about a mindset of treating ourselves with some kindness, some respect, interrupting that inner critic or inner perfectionist that some of us have. But also self-care can be actions that we take. It can be things that help us to alleviate stress. Could be simple things, right? You go for a walk, you exercise, you have a cup of tea, you go watch a movie that you enjoy, you listen to a song that lightens your mood, you go get a massage, whatever it might be, you go to the gym, you exercise, you do yoga. Could be things that help us to maintain our physical health, things that help to soothe pain or anxiety or stress. It can also be things like boundaries, saying no, asking for help when we need it, reaching a compromise with someone. setting up boundaries around our work, or it could be in personal relationships that have become too enmeshed or someone's become excessively dependent on us. Sometimes it's about putting up boundaries. And boundaries don't have to look like all or nothing. It can look like no, but it can also look like not yet. Or in order to do that, this is the kind of help or support I'm going to need. Sometimes boundaries look like advocating for our needs in a situation. So I think it's a balance of really looking at what are things I can do to support my health and well-being and alleviate stress in healthy ways. And also, where can I look at my life and say, I need to put up some boundaries here, or maybe I need to lean into some practices that really help me to build some skills to handle stress in healthier ways. Therapy could also be medical care, could also be a meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, could be a faith practice, prayer, journaling, writing, things that help to shift our mindset and some of the skills we bring to the challenges we face. So I think it's important to realize that self-care doesn't have to look like any one thing. It doesn't have to look like you went to the gym for 30 minutes, so self-care is done. Sometimes it's that moment where we interrupt our thinking and go, wow, I'm being really negative and harsh with myself. Let me take a moment to acknowledge I have a lot on my plate. I am one human being. I'm doing the best I can. Can I offer myself some grace? Can I realize I'm certainly not alone? There's other people that might be walking a similar path as me right now. And is there some small thing I could do to alleviate my own suffering in some way right now?
Should it be required, self-care? Should this be mandatory for parents, care providers, educators? I mean, minimally, people working with youth. What's your perspective around mandatory self-care practices?
Hmm. Um, hmm. So I'm pausing for a second because I'll be quite honest. I don't like, so self-care is putting our own oxygen mask on first, helping ourselves to self-regulate in order to help others, especially young people, to co-regulate, being able to practice that self-care and have those healthy boundaries to give a positive example of young people of how to be in the world and be able to care for ourselves and also help others. That example, that model is something we have to live in order for young people to truly see it and for them to start to see possibilities for them to show up in their own lives in ways that are resilient, in ways that are balanced, in ways that honor their self and others. My only issue is with the idea of something being required. And when it comes to things like education, which is the field that I work with the most, many of the evaluative processes that teachers undergo are not necessarily fair or accurate or actually support their professional growth or development. And what I would hate to see is a system that is broken, then attempt to evaluate people based upon their level of self-care, because here's a reality that I hold to. Self-care is essential, and it is often not enough if you work within broken systems, such as education, which is built to burn people out. And you can look at teacher retention data, you can look at burnout data. So in other words, is self-care essential? Yes. Is it enough? No. We also have to look at our systems. We also have to look at how do we create schools where there are school-wide practices that have educators feel connected, valued, supported, and inspired. If I'm a social worker, which I sometimes end up getting, sometimes mental health and social service agencies will contract me to work with them and consult with them, even though that's not my lane, but they feel like I can offer something to them. Even in those organizations, does your organization have your social workers, your therapists feel supported, connected, valued, inspired? What are the practices within your organization that cultivate that? And then we can look at our society at large. If we aren't addressing things like racism and poverty and systemic inequities and the ways that these things intersect, if we aren't addressing those forms of trauma and doing that racial and social justice work, self-care is not enough. So it goes hand in hand. So self-care is essential, and we have to be doing that. And self-care is essential to maintain our voices while we do that social justice work, because that is exhausting and depleting. especially if we're fighting against a type of oppression that we also experience day to day. You know, I'm a queer person. If I go to talk about homophobia and transphobia in schools and anti-LGBTQ plus bullying and discrimination and all these things, I'm talking about things I've lived through. So at the end of the day, I'm exhausted. So self-care is essential for me to maintain my voice in order to continue to do that advocacy work. So self-care can sometimes look like collective advocacy. So when you said required, I get nervous about that, because if a system's broken, should it encourage self-care? Yes. Should it provide resources for employees to practice and learn about self-care? Absolutely. And it should also ask those employees, what do you need to feel connected, valued, supported, inspired here in this workplace? What could we do as an organization, as a school, to meet some of those needs? So it goes hand in hand.
Thank you for that, Ricky. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Aubrey, you see anything? Barbara, I don't know if others, we have Ricky for a few more minutes, so he's one of the best.
Yeah.
Let's see what questions y'all may have. Aubrey, you got something?
I do have something, and I just want to say, you know, Ricky, you're getting some serious accolades in the chat. But you know, one question I want to ask is, so I was raised in a very military household. I went to the military myself. I operate, you know, in a way that may be considered sort of strict. I mean, y'all know me. Oh, Barbie, I know you guys know me. I'm not really strict, but like strict parents, right? How do you balance, you know, having high expectations with still, you know, supporting my daughter in this case in the proper ways so that she's not feeling some type of trauma from, you know, these high expectations.
And let me add to that, this Barbara. It's about how I was raised also as a Black, my family as an African-American family, and some of the values we had on how we raised the children at that time. My family, there's certain things you did do, didn't do, and I'm not necessarily like Aubrey as a military, but there was some things within our family, not just, you know, our family makeup, our culture, that you just didn't do. And your behavior had to be in line.